For generations, a persistent and dismissive myth has dominated the global understanding of rural Asian livelihoods. It is the myth of the static, unchanging East, the romanticized belief that the terraced mountainsides, the complex irrigation networks, and the forest-dependent communities of South and Southeast Asia are early remains of a timeless past, preserved in amber, isolated from the currents of history. In this framing, traditional farmers are viewed not as active historical agents who shape their landscapes through careful decisions, but as passive inheritors of an instinctual, almost biological relationship with nature. But this visual appreciation hides a major academic disagreement. Recent archaeological digs and historical ecological reviews have challenged this view, revealing that Asia's traditional agrarian landscapes are not ancient, accidental features. Instead, they are highly advanced, dynamic, and adaptive socio-ecological systems engineered to handle extreme monsoonal change, political crises, and imperial pressures. They did not survive for centuries because they were static. They survived because they were constantly adaptive. Today, we will explore these systems to understand how they functioned, how they negotiated power with ancient states, and why their modern loss represents one of the most critical socio-ecological crises of our time. To understand the survival of rural Asian livelihoods, we must first study the physical stage upon which they co-evolved. The geography of Southeast Asia countries and the wider Asian continent is defined by a single, dominating climatic phenomenon: the monsoon regime. Twice a year, the winds reverse direction, bringing alternating periods of intense, heavy rainfall and long-lasting, severe drought. This extreme seasonal change meant that any civilization attempting to settle the river valleys and volcanic hillsides had to master the flow of water. The region we know today as Southeast Asia, encompassing both the mainland peninsulas of Southeast countries like Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, and the archipelagic territories of Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines, presents a remarkable variety of terrains. These range from the dry, rain-shadowed plains of north-central Sri Lanka and the steep, rugged montane slopes of northern Luzon, to the rich, volcanic hillsides of Bali and Java. Each of these microenvironments demanded a local, highly specific ecological blueprint to secure human survival. For decades, the historical background of ancient Southeast Asia was framed by Eurocentric, colonial-era diffusionist models. These theories argued that early state formation and agricultural technology in the region were outside imports, suggesting that local populations were simply receptive vessels for more advanced ideas originating from the precocious empires of China and India. Some scholars even linked this to deep prehistoric migrations, prompting the uncertain question of where did Asian people come from. These models suggested that agricultural and metallurgical advances were carried southward by migrating waves of people who displaced simpler hunter-gatherer populations. However, late 20th century archaeological investigations have thoroughly dismantled this passive view. Digs in northern and northeastern Thailand, most notably at prehistoric sites like Bon Cheong and Bon Nadi on the Korat Plateau, have yielded evidence of highly advanced, indigenous agricultural and metallurgical advances dating as far back as 500 BCE. These communities were cultivating wet rice, domesticating animals, and casting bronze and iron long before any direct political control from foreign centralized empires. The archaeological record demonstrates that the early inhabitants of Southeast countries did not wait for foreign technologies to civilize them. This maritime exchange was not a simple luxury trade. It was a deeply connected economic pipeline. Through the Maritime Silk Road, the physical geography of Southeast countries was connected directly to the major trade centers of China, India, and the West. Scholars such as Kenneth R. Hall have documented how the flow of goods like spices, fine cotton textiles, ivory, and semi-precious beads shaped the early political landscape. Monks, merchants, and craftsmen traveled along these routes, supporting a major cross-cultural blending of artistic and technological styles. Indeed, the recovery of Roman glass, pottery, and gold coins at sites like Kattakaduwa proves that ancient Southeast Asia was deeply connected to the global economy as early as the 1st and 2nd centuries CE. Instead, their survival methods and local-scale adaptations to the monsoonal landscape were the primary engines driving social complexity and early state formation in the region. Furthermore, these ancient communities were not isolated. They were active participants in wide regional trade and exchange networks. Through maritime trade routes that connected South Asia, Southeast Asia, and China, local societies exchanged forest products, spices, and craft goods for high-value status items. Trade relations with the Roman Empire and the later development of India and Southeast Asia relations introduced luxurious materials, manufactured goods, and religious ideas. The discovery of Roman gold coins and Eratine pottery at coastal sites like Kattakaduwa on the Coromandel coast of southern India, and the recovery of roulette-ware pottery at ports across ancient Southeast Asia point to a highly connected maritime network that existed in the 1st century CE. The strength of India and Southeast Asia relations was not based on political conquest or military colonization. Instead, it was a process of careful localization. Local Southeast Asian elites willingly adopted and adapted specific Indian administrative, legal, and religious concepts to strengthen their own status and organize their growing agricultural societies. Sanskrit literature, Buddhist monastic institutions, and Hindu-derived legal codes were combined with indigenous customs and beliefs to create unique, regional forms of statecraft and community organization. This dynamic synthesis is clearly illustrated in the early ports of trade. Ports like Oka-io in the Mekong Delta, associated with the early state of Funan, acted as important gateways where foreign merchants, local producers, and regional chiefs met. The rulers of Funan strengthened their control over the coastline, deriving large revenues from trade-related fees, which they used to fund public works and organize local water management networks. Rather than being simple receptors, these early societies actively managed their coastal and riverine environments, establishing a strong socio-economic foundation that would support the rise of later mainland and island kingdoms. As these early agrarian communities expanded, they entered into complex, often flexible relationships with the historic states that developed around them. In the study of Southeast Asia history, historians have long struggled to define these traditional polities using European definitions of statehood, which assume fixed borders, centralized bureaucracies, and absolute territorial sovereignty. In ancient Southeast Asia, power was not cartographic. It was demographic and ritualistic. To understand this properly, we must study the two contrasting political models that shaped the rural Asian landscape: the decentralized Galactic polity or Mandala system of the Indianized world, and the highly centralized bureaucratic model of the Sinicized world. Under the Mandala model, which dominated most of mainland and island Southeast Asia, including historical Siam, Burma, Cambodia, and the Javanese empires, traditional kingdoms operated as galactic polities. Power was concentrated in a central court, which served as an exemplary center, reflecting the divine order of the Hindu-Buddhist universe. This power radiated outward through concentric rings of semi-independent provinces, locally termed muang. The outer rings consisted of tributary kingdoms that acknowledged the spiritual and moral superiority of the center by sending periodic tribute, yet retained complete operational control over their own lands and manpower. As historian O.W. Wolters and anthropologist Stanley Tumbia have shown, the Mandala was not geographic, and certainly not cartographic. It was a center-oriented space where borders were deliberately left flexible and vague. A prime example was the kingdom of Ayutthaya in Siam. Ayutthaya consisted of 3 concentric rings of muong, whose governors or inherited princes enjoyed the personal loyalty of the surrounding villages. The inner circle comprised muong, whose rulers were closely involved in the ceremonial cycle at court and subject to direct royal oversight. The second circle comprised more distant, semi-independent muong, which themselves claimed tribute from local subsidiary villages. Beyond these were outer tributary kingdoms whose rulers acknowledged Ayutthaya's superiority, but might also acknowledge the superiority of other rival powers. This decentralized, patron-client structure meant that ordinary rural populations were not micromanaged by the royal court. Instead, they navigated political pressures by playing competing lords off one another, utilizing the spatial mobility of their flexible frontiers to escape state exploitation. This stood in sharp contrast to the highly centralized administrative system of northern Vietnam, known historically as Dai Viet. Heavily influenced by East Asian bureaucratic structures inherited from a millennium of Chinese rule, the Dai Viet state established the village as its basic administrative, financial, and tax-collecting unit. In a landmark interdisciplinary study, researchers Melissa Dell, Nathan Lane, and Pablo Quirrell used a regression discontinuity design to compare nearby Vietnamese villages across the historical border established in 1698 between the centralized Dai Viet state and the former Cambodian Khmer territory. The Khmer Empire, following the Indianized patron-client model, had a weak control over its periphery, relying on highly personalized, unstable relationships with local strongmen rather than institutional village intermediation. The Dai Viet state, by contrast, possessed an unusually penetrating state capacity by Southeast Asian standards. The imperial court imposed strict tax and military recruitment quotas directly on the village as a collective unit. To prevent the rise of independent local lords who could challenge royal authority, the state actively protected the property rights of independent smallholders, enforced periodic land redistribution, and regulated the financial registry of village land through detailed cadastral records. What Dell, Lane, and Quirrell discovered was a major historical contradiction. One might assume that a penetrating, demanding state would crush local action. However, the researchers found that by setting strict quotas at the village level and preventing the rise of private, exploitative landlords, the historic Vietnamese state successfully crowded in local collective action. Because the village was collectively responsible for meeting state demands, building public works, and managing local land, villagers were forced to work together. This historical crowding in established lasting civic norms, high social capital, and mutual trust that remained long after the original dynastic state disappeared. Today, over 150 years after French colonization disrupted these traditional structures, households and villages historically ruled by Dai Viet still show around 1/3 higher consumption standards, are twice as likely to participate in civic organizations, and organize more effective local public goods and charity redistribution than those on the former Khmer side of the border. The conflict between these two opposing ideas of the state came to a head during the late 19th century, as European colonial powers began to actively carve up the region. For centuries, the flexible boundaries of the Mandala had allowed the Siamese, Burmese, and Lao kingdoms to coexist with central Vietnam and the Chinese Empire. But 19th century European colonialists did not understand overlapping or flexible sovereignty. The French, determined to push their Indo-Chinese colonial state to the west, renewed old Vietnamese tributary claims over Lao and Cambodian territories, reinterpreting them through the European lens of fixed, hard territorial boundaries. The traditional Siamese response, taken within the context of the Mandala system, was to leave the frontier areas flexible. Outer Muong between two power centers were never left with an either-or choice. Tribute was offered to and accepted by both Siamese and Vietnamese courts, but the French forced the Siamese into a race against time. Between 1885 and 1893, Siam was forced to rapidly reform its entire political structure. Under the visionary leadership of King Chulalongkorn, Siam abandoned its own Mandala conception of empire. To survive, the kingdom changed itself as a modern state in the European sense, with fixed surveyed frontiers, a centrally appointed provincial bureaucracy, and uniform national laws applied throughout its territory. This transition was completed through military force during the so-called Pak Nam incident of 1893, when French gunboats sailed up the Chao Phraya River, forcing Siam to cede Lao territories east of the Mekong. The victory of French gunboat diplomacy marked the final defeat of the Mandala as a model for political relations and the ultimate triumph of the modern territorial state. The answer lies in a different kind of institution, not a bureaucratic court, but the self-organizing, democratic hydrology of the communities themselves. Where the state was decentralized, the coordination of survival was built in the landscape, organized around sacred water and shared labor.
But this finding raises a much bigger question. If a strong, intrusive historical state was required to crowd in collective action in Vietnam, how did the decentralized, mandala-based societies of ancient Southeast Asia survive for centuries without this centralized coercion?
Dating back to at least the 9th century, the Balinese Subak represents one of the most advanced and strong community-based water management systems in human history. Practiced across the terraced volcanic hillsides of Bali, the Subak is far more than a masterpiece of indigenous hydraulic engineering. It is a living, complex adaptive system that has supported intensive wet rice, so a cultivation for over 1,000 years without a centralized state bureaucracy or the use of modern artificial inputs. At the core of the Subak is the Balinese Hindu philosophical concept of Trihita Karana. Translated literally, it requires the balance of harmony and balance between three distinct realms: the human realm, harmony among fellow humans; the natural realm, harmony between humans and the environment; and the spiritual realm, harmony between humans and the divine. In the context of agriculture, this philosophy is not a passive sentiment. It is a highly functional, legally binding system that governs the daily sharing of water and land. The physical design of the system is a marvel of gravity-fed engineering. Water is sourced from high-altitude volcanic crater lakes, most notably Lake Batter, and mountain springs, flowing downward through a complex, hand-carved network of canals, stone weirs, tunnels, and aqueducts. Sunk into the ground at various terrace levels are bamboo shunts and aqueducts that carry water from one level to another or draw off excess water to prevent soil erosion and landslips on the steep volcanic slopes. But how is this complex resource shared without conflict and without a centralized administrative state? The answer lies in the unique role of Bali's water temples. Rather than being purely religious structures, the water temples serve as the physical and institutional nodes of the Subak management. Temples are placed at the key geographic points where rivers and streams are diverted into major canals. The farmers of Bali are organized into highly democratic, decentralized collectives, also known as Subaks, each consisting of 50 to 400 farmers who share a single water source. Each Subak operates with complete independence, led by a customary official known as the PKSEH, who is democratically chosen and elected by the farmers themselves. The PKSEH is supported by a structured, elected administration, a deputy, Petaju, a clerk, Penyari Khan, a treasurer, a courier, Kasinoman, and other specific roles. The Subaks gather at the water temples to make collective, democratic decisions. Under the coordination of the temple priests and elected leaders, the Subaks coordinate their planting, irrigation, and fallow schedules across entire watersheds. This synchronized system achieved two vital ecological functions. 1. Pest control. By flooding and fallowing entire sections of the landscape simultaneously, the Subak system successfully starves out insect and rodent populations, eliminating the need for chemical pesticides. 2. Water sharing. Upstream landowners willingly restrict their water intake during critical periods to ensure that downstream farmers receive a fair share, preventing the control of resources and maintaining social unity. Through the Subak, Balinese society managed to decouple agricultural production from centralized state coercion, creating a highly strong, self-governing, and egalitarian system of resource management. While the Balinese engineered volcanic mountainsides, the ancient builders of Sri Lanka faced an entirely different hydrological challenge. In the semi-arid, dry zone of north-central Sri Lanka, rain falls only during a brief, erratic monsoon season, followed by months of extreme heat and strong drought. To survive in this harsh climate, ancient Sri Lankans developed what is perhaps the most advanced rain harvesting system of the ancient world, the Cascaded tank village system, known locally as the Ellangawa. Recognized today as a globally important agricultural heritage system, GAIAs, by the Food and Agriculture Organization FAO, the Ellangawa is not a collection of isolated ponds. It is a complex, highly connected network of thousands of small and large, interconnected earthen reservoirs, called tanks or wua, organized within microcatchments across the dry zone landscape. The Ellangawa system was engineered to reuse every drop of water with maximum efficiency. This hydraulic system was described in detail in ancient chronicles like the Mahavamsa and verified through lithic inscriptions dating back to the Anuradhapura kingdom. Ancient engineers and Buddhist monastic institutions worked to establish a highly systematic, sustainable water management policy. Monks oversaw the distribution of water and monitored irrigation schedules, ensuring that shared rules were strictly followed. The Ellangawa was a complex adaptive socio-ecological system designed to absorb climate-induced monsoonal shocks, utilizing its connected reservoirs to store seasonal runoff and filter out heavy sediment before the water reached the domestic fields. Each part of the cascade, from the forested catchments to the soil salinity vegetative barriers, worked in tandem with the human community to maintain ecological stability for over 1,500 years. Water flowed from higher elevation tanks to lower ones in a carefully planned cascade, storing, conveying, and utilizing surface runoff from ephemeral rivulets. The system was protected by advanced ecological zones, the Kattakaduwa, a specific vegetative belt planted along the outer bund of the tank. This dense strip of trees and reeds served as a natural biofilter, absorbing heavy salt ions from the water to reduce soil salinity in the downstream paddy fields. It also produced medicinal plants and raw materials for making mats and traditional handicrafts. The Biso Kotua, a revolutionary engineering design, a stone-lined vertical shaft or valve tower built inside the tank. The Biso Kotua regulated the outward pressure of the water before it was released into the canals, preventing the high-velocity discharge from washing away the delicate earthen canal walls. The Ellangawa supported a highly varied, circular rural livelihood strategy. It closely connected wet-season rice farming in the lowlands, intensive home gardening, upland shifting cultivation, china, and freshwater fishing in the tanks. Furthermore, during the off-season dry months, the exposed reservoir beds and fallow fields served as vital shared grazing lands for cattle and water buffalo. Historically, this massive system was governed by a lasting, decentralized, yet highly organized system of collective management. Traditional water management was connected to the political, institutional, and social setup at the village level, operating under the moral guidance of the Buddhist monastic institutions. The system maintained specific, inherited roles to ensure its functioning. The Wvidane, the officer in charge of the paddy fields, coordinating the agricultural calendar. The Wvidane, the officer in charge of the irrigation channels and tank maintenance. The Gamarala, the nobleman or village leader who managed local disputes. The Mohotala, the local sheriff or administrative representative, the veterala, the local physician who managed traditional herbal medicine, the anomedirala, the approving officer who verified shared water-sharing agreements, the denomedirala, the wise man of the village, consulted for ecological and social crises. This village setup was supported by the Rajakariya system, a caste-based occupational structure that bound families to specific duties, ranging from farming and blacksmithing to building hydraulic works. While modern perspectives question the unfairness of the caste system, historically it succeeded in maintaining and transferring specific, highly technical knowledge of hydraulic management across generations. The cultural fabric of the village was completely connected with this tank culture. Daily life, rituals, and artistic expressions evolved to celebrate the tank. This is clearly recorded in traditional folklore, folk songs, and poems. Nalun Kavi, beautiful, rhythmic poems recited by women as they worked in groups to weed and transplant paddy shoots, coordinating their collective labor to the melody. Paul Kavi, sad, protective poems recited by men during long, lonely nights spent in elevated watch huts, guarding the ripening fields from wild elephants and boars. Folk dances, specific agrarian dances such as Kalagedi Natuma and Kunatuma, depicting the winnowing of rice on the threshing floor, which celebrated the harvesting of the paddy. Yet around 1000 AD, this entire ancient system collapsed and was abandoned for centuries. Stratigraphic and historical studies point to two simultaneous shocks: a political shock, the invasion and overthrow of the Anuradhapura kingdom, and a long-lasting, devastating climatic drought. When the political and ecological limits were exceeded, the complex adaptive system broke down. The population moved to the wet zone, and the great tanks were swallowed by the dry zone jungle.
This is where the evidence becomes especially important. The Ellangawa did not just support isolated villages. It sustained Anuradhapura, the grand capital of Sri Lanka's hydraulic civilization. Archaeological research by Durham University has revealed that Anuradhapura was a unique urban form. A low-density, dispersed agrarian urbanism. Rather than a densely packed city separated from rural fields, Anuradhapura integrated urban, religious, and agricultural spaces into a sprawling network covering over 10,000 hectares. All sustained by the rural Cascade network.
While lowland communities engineered complex water networks, the mountainous highlands and forested interiors of South and Southeast Asia were home to millions of indigenous and tribal peoples whose survival methods were rooted in the forest ecosystem. For these forest-dependent economies, the forest was not simply a source of timber. It was a rich, diverse safety net and a site of major biocultural balance. In the tribal heartland of central India, the Baiga and Gond Adivasi communities have lived in close symbiosis with the forest for centuries. The Baiga, recognized as a particularly exposed tribal group, possess a remarkable, inherited knowledge of wild, edible, and medicinal plants. Traditionally, they practiced a form of shifting swidden agriculture known as Baywar. The Baiga's relationship with the land was governed by a major, sacred rule. They famously refused to use a metal plow. To the Baiga, dragging a metal blade through the earth was a mortal sin, equivalent to scratching the breast of Mother Earth. Instead, they cultivated small patches of cleared forest using wooden sticks, relying heavily on the natural recovery cycle of the forest and the gathering of non-timber forest products, or NTFPs. NTFPs, including wild honey, tendu leaves, used for rolling traditional beedi cigarettes, sal seeds, and the sweet, fleshy flowers of the mahua tree, distilled into a traditional liquor and used as a vital food supplement, functioned as a critical livelihood safety net. Because these forest products are harvested from diverse, strong natural ecosystems, they are much less exposed to pests, droughts, and monsoonal failures than commercial, single-crop agricultural fields. Furthermore, organizations like the Non-Timber Forest Products Exchange Program, NTFPP, have documented that the harvesting of these products is a powerful engine for gender equity in rural Asia. Because the gathering, sorting, and processing of wild forest foods, leaves, and resins is primarily carried out by women, protecting community forest tenure directly enhances women's economic leadership, financial independence, and decision-making power within rural institutions. The Gond community, another large Adivasi group in the region, is also intimately connected to the forest environment. Their cultural traditions center on the worship of the Saja, Indian laurel, tree, and the celebration of harvest festivals like Pola to honor their cattle and agricultural cycles. However, these traditional livelihoods are under strong pressure from modern conservation policies and resettlement programs. In the early 2000s, the border delineation of the Kanha Tiger Reserve buffer zone resulted in the removal of several Gond and Baiga villages, such as Baharakar, out of their ancestral forest territories. This resettlement had a highly damaging, mixed impact. On one hand, it severely restricted the geographic area villagers could forage in for NTFPs, eroding their traditional ecological knowledge. On the other hand, it forced them to transition to settled farming on allotted lands and seek wage labor under government schemes. This is most clearly seen in the ancient tradition of sacred groves, known by various indigenous names, such as the Law Kintong in the Himalayas or the Kovil Kadugal in Tamil Nadu. These are relic patches of primary forest, ranging from a few trees to hundreds of acres, preserved in the name of local deities and ancestral spirits. Supported by powerful social taboos that strictly prohibit the cutting of any vegetation, the clearing of land, or the grazing of animals, these sacred groves have functioned for centuries as critical community-enforced conservation zones. In an increasingly deforested landscape, they remain vital refugia for endangered flora and fauna, protecting rare microwatersheds and preserving the agrobiodiversity of the surrounding fields.
Let's pause here for a moment. The traditional forest-dependent livelihoods did not just sustain human bodies. They actively preserved the biological diversity of the landscape.
The traditional rural economy of Asia was never restricted solely to primary agricultural extraction. Instead, the village was supported by highly developed craft industries that operated in close symbiosis with local markets, regional trade networks, and royal courts. These craft traditions, textile weaving, metalworking, and pottery, served as critical sources of extra income during the lean agricultural months and formed an essential part of the cultural and social fabric of rural communities. Textile production represents one of the most culturally significant and technically complex craft traditions in the region. Historically, weaving and spinning were almost exclusively the domain of women. Hand weaving was considered cool work in symbolic contrast to the hot qualities associated with male-dominated pursuits like blacksmithing and metallurgy. In island Southeast Asia, techniques like Javanese batik reached remarkable levels of skill. Batik is a wax-resist dyeing technique that involves drawing complex patterns on cotton or silk cloth with a pen-like copper reservoir tool called a chanting. The patterns drawn held deep symbolic meanings, with specific, sacred motifs reserved for court ceremonies, while others were traded across regional maritime routes. The value of these textiles was closely tied to the complex chemistry of natural dyes, such as blue derived from the indigo plant, Indigofera, and rich red from the Morinda plant, Morinda citrifolia, requiring dozens of precise immersions to achieve brilliant, enduring colors. These craft traditions varied widely by region and ethnicity. In Sikkim, for example, the indigenous Lepcha community was celebrated for its specific bamboo crafts and traditional loom spinning, while the Bhutia community preserved ancient Tibetan practices of carpet and rug weaving using pure vegetable dyes. The Nepali community, which settled in the region, was famous for its silver and woodwork. In South Asia, the origins of these craft industries were deeply tied to the ancient guild system. By the post-Mauryan and Gupta eras, artisans had organized themselves into powerful, self-regulating associations known as Shrenis. Each Shreni was led by an elected head, Shreshti, and a council of elders, operating under its own written codes and customary rules. The Shrenis functioned not only as trade associations that controlled quality, set prices, and trained apprentices, but also as social security networks and financial banks that enjoyed significant protection and patronage from regional kingdoms and royal workshops. In rural areas, this was mirrored by the Jaimane system, which bound inherited artisans, such as the potter Kumbar, the carpenter, and the blacksmith Lohar, to the dominant landowning agricultural groups through traditional, non-market mutual ties. This was a highly ranked, yet symbiotic and stable relationship. The Jaimane system operated outside the systems of modern market economies. It was an inherited, highly stable social order that preserved technical craftsmanship and ensured the survival of the village during times of crop failure. Because the potter, the blacksmith, and the weaver were bound to the agricultural harvest, they did not have to cultivate land themselves, allowing them to focus entirely on perfecting their specific crafts. This system was supported by a shared set of cultural and religious values, where the exchange of goods and services was viewed as a sacred, mutual duty rather than a simple financial transaction. The artisan families worked under the protection and hospitality of the landowning class, judgment. When a festival occurred, the landowner would request the potter to make ceremonial clay pots and diyas, and in return, the potter was paid in kind with a regular share of the agricultural harvest, grain, clothing, and food for the rest of the year. This system ensured that the village remained a self-sufficient unit, producing its own food, tools, clothes, and shelter without relying on external commercial markets. It was the result of a deliberate, demanding colonial policy of de-industrialization. During the 19th century, the connection of South and Southeast Asia into European colonial empires dismantled the economic foundations of the village economy. Traditional Indian textile weavers, who for centuries produced the internationally famous fine cotton fabrics like muslin and calico, lost both their domestic and global export markets. This was not because their work was inferior, but because British colonial trade policies flooded the country with cheap, machine-made cotton textiles manufactured in the industrial factories of Manchester, while imposing heavy tariffs on the export of finished Indian goods. The impact of this deindustrialization was devastating. Millions of highly skilled weavers and artisans lost their livelihoods. Stripped of their traditional professions, they were forced to migrate to rural areas, putting immense pressure on the land and agriculture. This process created a massive new class of landless agricultural laborers, depressed rural wages, and locked the subcontinent into a cycle of deep, structural rural poverty. As William Bentinck, the Governor-General of India, famously recorded in 1835, "The bones of the cotton weavers are bleaching the plains of India."
To understand this properly, we need to separate myth from evidence. The decline of these traditional industries was not a natural, inevitable consequence of inefficient handiwork failing to compete with modern technology.
While land-based communities engineered the soil, the wide coastlines, rivers, and wetland systems of Southeast Asia supported mobile, water-based populations whose survival methods were centered on flexible, non-territorial boundaries. Today, these riverine and marine livelihoods are experiencing rapid, often forced transitions driven by modern geopolitical division, state sedentarization, and massive upstream infrastructure projects. The riverine communities of Cambodia's Tonle Sap Lake face an unprecedented ecological and social crisis. The Tonle Sap is the largest freshwater lake in Southeast Asia and forms the heart of the lower Mekong Basin's capture fishery, historically providing Cambodia with over 75% of its annual inland fish catch. The lake's output is driven by a unique hydrological phenomenon known as the flood pulse. During the heavy monsoon season, The massive volume of water flowing down the Mekong River forces the Tonle Sap River to reverse its flow. This forces the lake to expand its surface area from 2,500 square kilometers in the dry season to over 15,000 square kilometers, flooding the surrounding forests and creating fertile breeding and feeding grounds for hundreds of fish species. But this ancient ecosystem is being systematically dismantled. The construction of massive hydropower dams along the mainstream and tributaries of the Mekong River has disrupted the natural flood pulse. These hydrosocial changes have led to a devastating decline in fish numbers and variety. During the wet season, the lake is smaller, has a lower carrying capacity, and deposits fewer nutrients. During the dry season, the water levels remain higher, reducing the land available for traditional recession rice cultivation. But as fish stocks collapse due to dams and overexploitation, their traditional way of life is becoming unsustainable. Stripped of fish, they are forced to shift to small-scale chicken raising, vegetable farming on dry lands, or migrate as low-paid wage laborers to urban centers like Phnom Penh, finally severing their connection to the water. A similar crisis is unfolding across the coastlines of Southeast Asia, home to the sea nomads, including the Sama-Bajau and Orang Suku Laut in Indonesia, and the Urak Lawoi and Moken in Thailand. Historically, these Austronesian groups lived entirely on houseboats, kabang, or temporary stilt dwellings in littoral zones, roaming freely across the vast waters to harvest rich marine resources. The sea nomads developed an aquapelagic orientation, a deeply rooted cognitive system and set of values passed down through generations where the sea, not the land, was their territory. Historically, the Tonle Sap Lake also acted as a zone of refuge, attracting ethnic groups fleeing civil war and state repression in Vietnam and China. Many ethnic Vietnamese around the lake can trace their roots back to refugee groups who fled southern Vietnam centuries ago during the Trinh Nguyen War. Over generations, these communities developed a remarkable floating existence, adapting completely to the lake's seasonal pulse. In island Southeast Asia, the sea nomad communities also relied on the Javanese and Malay tradition of gotong royong, meaning mutual cooperation toward a shared goal. This collective spirit of mutual assistance was essential for marine resource management, organizing shared reef cleanup, building temporary stilt homes, and coordinating long-distance seafaring voyages across the Coral Triangle. Based on linguistic studies, these groups are divided into three distinct communities. Moken/Moklen, found primarily in Thailand and Myanmar. Urak Lawoi/Orang Lot/Orang Suku Laoti, located across Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia. Sama-Bajau, widely shared throughout the Philippines, Malaysia, and Indonesia. These nomadic maritime communities show distinct mobility patterns, exploring the sea on houseboats and adjusting their routes in response to seasonal monsoonal changes. Genetic and physiological studies have even documented that the sea nomads have developed unique biological adaptations, such as larger spleens, to support deep, long-duration diving for marine resources. But the rise of modern nation-states and bureaucratic borders has restricted their mobility. The creation of marine protected areas, MPAs, for biodiversity conservation has frequently banned their traditional, low-impact foraging practices, while the private control of coastal lands for luxury tourism infrastructure has restricted their access to vital shoreline resources like firewood, freshwater, and materials for temporary shelters. A prime example is the Orang Suku Laut of the Lingga Regency in Indonesia. Traditionally holding a deep spiritual connection to the mangrove forests, modern economic pressures and the loss of their fishing grounds have forced some members of this community to cut down mangroves to supply the illegal charcoal industry. Thus, the very policies designed to civilize and develop These communities have forced them into environmentally destructive survival methods that undermine the long-term sustainability of the coastal ecosystems they once protected.
The impact of this hydrosocial rupture is not evenly distributed. It falls heaviest on the forgotten people of the lake. Ethnic Vietnamese, Cham, and Khmer fishermen who live in floating villages. Out of the 3 million people dependent on the tunnel sap, many are considered non-immigrant foreigners, denied legal status, land rights, or formal citizenship. Living in stilted homes or houseboats accessible only by water, they adapt completely to the lake's rhythms.
The systematic disappearance of rural Asian livelihoods is not an accidental result of time. It is the direct consequence of a series of modern structural ruptures. The first and most widespread of these ruptures was the Green Revolution of the 1960s and 70s. By introducing high-yielding hybrid crop varieties, chemical fertilizers, and artificial pesticides, the Green Revolution succeeded in dramatically increasing cereal yields across Asia, temporarily averting famine. But this intensive, highly machine-based monoculture model has left a strong, long-term environmental legacy. The repeated application of chemical inputs has caused widespread soil degradation, nutrient imbalances, and groundwater depletion. Continuous rice monoculture and long-term water saturation of paddy soils have led to an accumulation of toxicities, micronutrient deficiencies, and a drastic decline in agrobiodiversity. Chemical pesticides have contaminated regional waterways, decimated beneficial insect populations, and locked farmers into a cycle of debt and dependency on multinational corporations. As agricultural yields stall and the costs of chemical inputs rise, the income of traditional farming has collapsed, driving millions of smallholders out of agriculture. This rupture is clearly illustrated in the Ifugao rice terraces of the Philippine Cordillera. Recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site and a globally important agricultural heritage system, GAIAs, these terraces have long been celebrated as ancient monuments to ecological harmony. But Stephen Akabado's pioneering archaeological research has decolonized this history, proving that the terraces are not 2,000 years old, as previously claimed by colonial textbooks. Using Bayesian modeling of radiocarbon, 14C, dates on tiered rice fields, Akabado and his colleagues discovered that the terraces were actually built during the 16th century. They were constructed by lowland populations who moved inland and upland to resist Spanish colonial conquest. The terraces were not an ancient, static relic of primitives, but a highly dynamic, practical adaptation and a zone of refuge designed to maintain food sovereignty in the face of imperial pressure. Today, this dynamic landscape is facing a different kind of pressure. Modern market connection and the need for cash income have forced Ifugao farmers to shift from cultivating traditional heirloom Tinawan rice to planting commercial vegetable cash crops like cabbage and potatoes. While Tinawan rice was cultivated once a year, allowing the terraces to rest and maintain soil stability, continuous vegetable farming requires heavy chemical inputs, shortens the soil recovery cycle, and causes massive soil erosion, leading to the collapse of the terrace walls. As younger generations migrate to lowland cities for wage employment, the shared labor structures, Gotong Royong or Bianehan, that maintain the terrace walls are eroding. At the same time, the rise of modern ecotourism has introduced new inequalities. Multilateral donors and governments often promote ecotourism as a sustainable solution, expecting indigenous communities to maintain their traditional rice landscapes for tourist consumption, even when it is financially unsustainable. A systematic review of ecotourism in South and Southeast Asia reveals that tourism frequently acts as a mechanism of loss, replacing stable survival economies with unstable, low-wage seasonal employment, while the profits are captured by lowland tour operators and hotel developers. The result is a tragic hydrosocial rupture. In the Philippines, this collective, community-led spirit is known as Bayanihan, the spirit of shared unity and cooperation. and pakikisama, being one with each other. Historically, these values were the cultural pillars that made the maintenance of the steep Ifugao terraces possible. To address the modern agricultural transition, joint programs like the Heirloom Rice Project have been launched to support traditional farming. This project seeks to make traditional cultivation of heirloom Tinawan rice financially viable by developing premium niche markets and providing smallholder subsidies, helping farmers balance cultural obligations with cash income needs without resorting to destructive vegetable cash cropping. As the traditional ecological knowledge (TK) held by elders, especially women who traditionally manage seed selection, is lost and collective labor systems collapse, the rural Asian commons are disappearing.
Let's pause here for a moment. The tragedy of the sea nomads is that state conservation and economic development have forced them to settle on land, leading to what researchers call a double marginalization.
The systematic collapse of rural Asian livelihoods is not simply a loss of historic charm or visual beauty. It is the loss of some of the most advanced, tested models of circular resource management and climate resilience that humanity has ever engineered. In traditional Asian values, from Indonesia's Gotong Royong and the Philippines' Pakikisama to Thailand's sufficiency economy and Vietnam's respect for nature, the concept of economy was never separated from ecological balance. It was rooted in the careful management of household and community resources to ensure long-term survival. As modern industrial agriculture faces a global crisis of climate change, soil degradation, and water pollution, the survival of humanity may depend on our ability to learn from these ancient, dynamic systems. We must move beyond static, romanticized conservation models that seek to freeze traditional communities in poverty for tourist consumption. Instead, we must support their local agency, secure their customary land tenure, and co-develop modern, co-adaptive advances that merge traditional wisdom with sustainable technology. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the landscapes of South and Southeast Asia. To our viewers, how can modern urban societies integrate the principles of collective responsibility and ecological harmony that allowed these traditional communities to survive for centuries? Let us know in the comments below, and please subscribe to help us keep these histories alive.
But this finding raises a much bigger question. Are we willing to value these traditional systems for their true ecological and social capital? Or will we continue to allow them to be sacrificed on the altar of short-term global market efficiency?